In my most recent video, I took the original Super Mario Bros. Game and turned it into a new 3D version in honor of the game's 35th anniversary, and people seem to really like it. I think what made it so special is that for the first time I made a game where all the assets were made by me, instead of relying on an external source like Sketchfab. So I decided to do the same thing again, in honor of another franchise celebrating their 35th anniversary this year, The Legend of Zelda. And in my last video, I made a joke about getting to 100,000 subscribers, since at the time I was only at 50,000, and now somehow I'm well past 200,000, one of whom is Ludwig. I guess the only thing left to do at this point is to head towards 1 million, hopefully by the end of the year, so subscribe. Usually when remaking a game, I tend to only create the character and then the first level of the game, and then create a video to go along those two things. I don't know what happened this time, but apparently I decided it was a good idea to create the entire overworld from the original Legend of Zelda. I think you might be starting to see why it's been so long since my last upload. I also decided to create all of the overworld enemies, and the items, all in the same voxel art style that I learned last time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. The first thing I wanted to do was get a working character model for Link. To get started, I based a model for Link off of the 8-bit amiibo that Nintendo released a couple of years ago. However, everything in the game has two distinct animation frames, so I needed to alter that model to create the second frame. Then I imported both models into Unity and made a basic walk cycle using these two models, but it looked kinda bad. I decided to create a third animation frame to pass through both of the other two frames by keeping his legs in the middle. Throwing this into the walk cycle makes it look much better. The next thing I wanted to do was make a model for swinging the sword. For this, Link swings his shield out to the side and thrusts his sword forward. His mouth also opens up slightly, and you can almost hear his famous shouting in the background. With these models finished, I was done working on Link for now, and then decided to start working on modeling the overworld, which is where I spent most of my time. I found a picture of the overworld which included everything I needed to know, including enemy spawns, item locations, and hidden entrances. With this I could get started. First I made a giant plane and scaled it up to match the dimensions of the map. Then I added a material to match the color of the ground from the game. The next thing I started doing was adding all of the rock structures. For this I used Pro Builder to trace the outline of the shape, and then I scaled it up to make it 3D. Then I went ahead and created a texture for the green rocks and applied it to a material that I could use on the new 3D shape. With the material applied, I could better visualize what it would look like, so I decided to make the structure 2 blocks tall based on the height of the texture. I repeated this same tracing process for the next few surrounding structures, and scaled them all up to be about the same height. Then I placed Link into the scene and tried getting a feel for it by walking around. It felt really claustrophobic as everything seemed either too narrow or too tall. To get around this, I scaled it down to be 1 layer tall again, but then I shrunk the top face of the structure and then scaled that up to be 1 layer tall. Doing this, I could keep the same height without everything feeling claustrophobic. At this point, I decided to zoom out and appreciate all the work that I've done so far, and oh, I've barely even done anything. I continued on by finishing the last of the green structures. The only tricky part was over here by the entrance to level 2. There's a ladder here that brings you up to a higher elevation. I created a texture for the ladder, but I didn't really know what to do after that. If I made a ladder that is perpendicular to the ground, that would mean that this area would be directly above this area, but the map shows that it's set further back. So instead of making it a ladder, I decided to make it a staircase. Luckily, Pro Builder has a feature to automatically build staircases, but I decided not to use this for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it displays the texture weirdly, and the second is that the camera will jitter when walking up or down the staircase. So instead I decided to just make it a flat plane and put it at an angle. With all the green structures done, I decided to start creating these little green bushes. First I created the model in Magic Voxel, and then I imported it over into Unity and scaled it up to match the dimensions with the dimensions of the map. Now if you remember, I made a joke last time about how much copying and pasting the developers of Super Mario Bros. Did, and yes, I realized that it was to keep the game files extremely small, but what those guys did is nothing compared to the amount of copying and pasting the developers of The Legend of Zelda did. The entire time I was placing around these bushes, I had my fingers glued to the Ctrl-C and V keys. By the end of it, my pinky was hurting from holding down the Control key for so long, and I'm actually surprised I finished it without seeing sticky keys pop up even once. Oh, and by the way, if you were curious, there are apparently over 1,800 of these green bushes. Now if we zoom out and look at the whole map, it actually looks like I've made a good amount of progress. So I decided to do the exact same again, but for the brown bushes this time. Luckily during all of this, I could select an entire group of bushes and copy and paste the entire group, so I didn't have to actually copy and paste thousands of bushes one by one. After finishing all the bushes, I decided to start modeling these rock statues. I don't know what they're actually supposed to be, but to me they look like snails, so I'd called them snail rocks. And I don't know what's wrong with my brain, but once again, I made a model that looks good from every angle except for the front, and it actually looks almost identical to the front-facing Koopa that I made previously. And now I decided that I wanted to start creating the water. I could have just placed a flat texture on top of the ground and called it water, but that would be boring. So I grabbed the water share that I've used in previous videos and used it again here with some textures that I made for the water. In order for the share to work properly, the object it's used on has to have multiple faces to make it look like the water's moving. If you use it on just one giant face, it makes it look really bad, which is probably why it didn't look all that great when I used it in the Sonic video. So I used Pro Builder to make a new shape and model it along the water. I don't really know much about 3D modeling, but I'm pretty sure having a lot of faces like this is generally bad, but it doesn't lag my game, so oh well. Now I wanted to make it look like the water level was below the beach, but the problem is that I used one giant plane to create the entire map. Apparently there's some experimental feature in Pro Builder that you can use to cut holes in faces, but when I tried to use it, Unity just crashed. So I tried it again, and it crashed again. I kept trying until finally it worked one time when I used a smaller cube, but after that it kept crashing, so I decided, alright, the water's just going on top of the beach now. And you know, technically I'm not wrong. I continued modeling the rest of the ponds and the lakes, and one of the rivers. I decided to save this river until later, and you'll see why when I get back to it. At this point, I decided to start modeling the brown rock structures that cover pretty much the rest of the map. The reason why I held off on doing this is because of all the ladders that change the elevation everywhere. There are some inconsistencies with the logic of the ladders. For example, down here there's a ladder that goes up, which should mean that everything from here on should be higher than the rest of the map. But continuing on from there, there's one more ladder that leads up to another point that's even higher. But right next to that is one ladder that returns back to the ground level. It doesn't make sense for two ladders to reach the same height as just one ladder, so that must mean that somewhere along the way the ground itself went down. There were a few places where I had to put ramps to change the elevation to match up with the ladders. The first spot is right here where I made a downwards ramp, and one is over here alongside the river, which is why I decided to hold off on that river. From here on, I just did a bunch of modeling to create the brown rock structures, and I gradually made the height increase as you go back, because I'm pretty sure this area is supposed to be Death Mountain. I also finished modeling the river, all the way up to the top, past the waterfall where there's a little pond. It's also worth noting that there's a secret in the top right corner of the map. In the original game, there's actually an invisible path leading up to a higher area, so I replicated this by turning off collisions on one of the blocks so that you can reach the ladder. Now if you zoom out, it looks like pretty much everything on the map is complete, except for two areas with white rock structures over here and over here. I made one more texture for the white rock and quickly made the outlines for these last two 3D models. There are also two rows of white bushes, so I had to go and change to a new color palette for the bushes to create a new material. And then, since this is a graveyard, I had to make new models for the gravestones. I also had to create a new material to make the ground into a gray color in these areas. At this point, if you zoom out, it looks like the map is complete, and now I just had to create a bunch of props to put on the finishing touches. Other than the bushes and the snail rocks, there are various other props that fill up the world. One of which is these suits of armor, that when touched actually turn into an enemy, but we'll get to that part later. At first I thought I could just use the model that I made for Link and swap on a new head to create the suit of armor, but it actually ended up being a bit more involved since the armor is actually thicker than Link is. Then I started making a model for the trees, and I realized while modeling the trees that the big tree dungeon entrances reused the same models except with a face in between, and it was a pretty similar process for making the other dungeon entrances and the obelisks. Then I placed these models in various places on the map, and turned off collisions on the openings so that Link could walk through them. I also realized that there are actually a few different versions of the dungeon entrances, one that has one eye, one that has two eyes, and one really large one that repeats the one eye texture twice. The final piece of the map that I had left was this desert area here that uses different textures for the floor, and with that, the entire map was now finished. I decided to take a quick stroll through the world that I recreated, but then I quickly got back to work after realizing that this is basically just a glorified walking simulator. At this point I wanted to start adding the enemies, so I took a look at all the enemies that appear in the overworld, and was really confused by one enemy in particular. Apparently the rock is an enemy because it falls down the screen and can hurt Link. Anyways, the first enemy that I started modeling was the Octorocks. It took me a few attempts to get something that I liked. The first few times were either too tall or too boxy looking. Finally I made something decent, and then moved the legs to create the second version to create the animation. And as with pretty much every enemy in the game, there's also a blue version of the Octorock. The next thing I did was edit the suits of armor to create the Armos enemy. Bumping into the armor suits will activate them, and turn them into an Armos. And then I made the Tektites who have a pretty familiar animation cycle. For the next few enemies, I used a similar method to create the 3D models. First I would create the 2D sprite from the front, and then create the 2D sprite from the side. Then I would lay them on top of each other, and start building off of that. This was the strategy I used to make the Lynels and the Moblins, and I could also do something similar for the Levers and the Peahats. Also, for the Moblins, I decided to give them the third animation frame similar to Link because it looked weird without it, and the Levers and Peahats don't have any animations, they just spin. Similarly, the Genie and the Zora only have one animation frame as well for some reason. With all of the enemy models finished, it was time to start making AI to make them move. And this was actually my first attempt at creating an AI, and while it works, it's probably the dumbest solution I could have come up with, so I gave it the appropriate name of Artificial Unintelligence, or ANI for short. Basically, I looked at how the enemies moved in the original game, and to me it looked like they just moved around randomly. So I decided to make a script that does exactly that. It works based off of randomly generated timers and randomly generated actions. By default, the enemy will start moving forward. Then it will create a random timer and randomly pick a number between 0 and 4. Each number represents a different action like rotating a specific direction or deciding to stop, and when the timer ends it will perform that action. If it stops, it does the exact same thing except that the stopping action is replaced with a go action, and it also has the ability to shoot a projectile while stopped. It's such a brute force method, but it looks pretty convincing, so I'm not complaining. But this specific script only works for the Octoroks, the Moblins, and the Lynels. I had to create different variations for the other enemies. I made a similar script for the Levers and the Peahats. When the script for them stops, they start to move down. The Levers will burrow underground, and the Peahats will stop spinning and land on the ground. Then I had to make another similar script as the first one for the Genie and the Armos. The only difference is that these enemies don't stop moving. Now for the Tektites, I had to write a completely new script because they have a unique movement pattern. I still applied the same logic though. Create a random timer, and when that timer ends, pick a random direction and jump. The last enemy script I made was for the Zoras. It combines elements from the first two scripts because these enemies shoot projectiles and they also randomly move below the water. The only new thing I had to add here was a trigger around the Zora, and once the player enters this trigger, the Zora will start facing in that direction. And with that, the enemies are now finished, so it's time for me to start making the items. First I gave Link the ability to get the upgraded swords. The wooden sword can be obtained from an old man in the cave at the beginning of the game. The white sword can be obtained from an old man in the cave near the top of the map, and it will do twice as much damage as the wooden sword. And finally, the magical sword can be obtained from an old man who lives beneath a grave in the graveyard. All of these swords also have the ability to shoot out a sword beam if Link has full health, and it will explode into 4 pieces on contact. I made a script that will change the material of the sword every few frames to give it the same look from the original game. Then I modeled the bow and 2 different arrow types since they function almost identically to the sword beam. The only difference between the normal arrows and the silver arrows is that the silver arrow does twice as much damage and is also needed to defeat Ganon. Next, I created a magical rod because it also uses the same projectile mechanic. It creates a beam that will do the same amount of damage as the white sword, and if Link gets the Book of Magic item, the beam will create a fireball when it makes contact with anything. The next item was simple because as far as I can tell, the only purpose of the flute was to drain the water level and reveal the entrance to the level 7. To create the boomerang, I just modified the projectile script so that it'll come back to Link after a short period of time, and for the magical boomerang, that period of time is slightly longer. The blue candle and the red candle will spawn fireballs, and while the blue candle can only spawn 1, the red candle can spawn them infinitely, enough to make me fear that my computer will crash. But these fireballs can also reveal secret entrances. The power bracelet lets you move certain objects, some of which reveal secret entrances. The bombs can be placed, and after exploding will create some smoke effects, and if placed in the correct spots will also reveal secret entrances. There are a lot of secrets in this game, but at least it's a secret to everybody. Obtaining the letter from the old man in a cave at the top of the map will allow Link to purchase potions from any of the old ladies. The blue life potions will restore your health once, and the red second potions will restore your health once, and then turn into a blue life potion. But to be able to purchase these potions, we need to get rupees first. So I made the rupees into a random drop from enemies. The one that flickers between yellow and blue is worth 1 rupee, while the blue one is worth 5 rupees. I also made it so that the enemies can randomly drop hearts, which will restore Link's health. The other 2 random drops that enemies may spawn are clocks, which will slow down all of the enemies and make Link invincible for a short time, and the fairies, which will completely restore Link's health. Then there's the heart container that will increase Link's health by 1 heart. And then there's the items that are used automatically in certain situations. The raft will allow Link to sail on water as long as he walks off of a dock, and a stepladder will allow Link to walk across gaps that he was previously unable to. Or you could use the stepladder to perform some trick shots Call of Duty style. The shield by default will block some projectiles, but getting the magical shield will block Link from all projectiles. And finally, the blue ring and the red ring will change the color of Link's clothes, as well as increase his defense. The blue ring will double Link's defense, and the red ring will double it again. After finishing the items, I got to work on adding the UI. I tried to replicate the look of the original with a black bar across the top, but it felt like it took away from the game, so I lowered the opacity on it. Then I just did everything exactly the same, except for the number of keys. The sword box will show the strongest sword that you have, and the item box will show your currently equipped item. Pressing Q and E will swap between all the items in your inventory. Then I made a simple counter for the number of rupees and bombs that Link currently has. I didn't mention this earlier, but Link will obviously lose rupees whenever he goes to a shop, but he will also lose 1 rupee per arrow that he shoots. And normally in Zelda games, Link has 20 hearts, but in this game he only has 16. And he also doesn't get quarters of a heart, because it only displays hearts in halves. The final thing I did for the UI was creating the minimap. I had to do some math to convert Link's position in world space to a position on screen space, and with that it will now track Link's position on the map. If I wanted to, I could easily swap out this blank map with a full map, but I'm not sure if the original had anything like that. And now it looks like the game is done, but now it's actually just an even more glorified walking simulator than it was before. Link still can't damage enemies, and they can't damage him either. I got to work on making it so that attacks will damage the player and the enemies, and also made it so that when anyone receives damage, they have a knockback force applied to them, and start changing color for a brief period of time. When testing this knockback feature, I binded it to a button at first to test if it was working properly, and accidentally made a really cool speedrunning mechanic similar to the ones found in other Zelda games. Then the last thing I did was make it so that running out of health will create a death explosion effect, and with that, the entire overworld is now finished. I decided to hold off on making them dungeon levels for now because this video has already taken long enough to make, and I don't actually know how to make boss fights yet, so I might save that for another video. And just like the Mario remake I made, I can't release this game either, but if you guys want to watch some extended gameplay, I made a video on my second channel for you guys to watch. Alright, see ya.